Hola a todos y muy buenos días. Hoy vamos a hablar de la historia y la cultura de Cuba. Cuba es una isla, right? Es una isla, island, en el Caribe. Es la isla más grande del Caribe. It's the largest island in the Caribbean. Y ahora vamos a hablar de la historia, the history a little bit of Cuba. So in 1492, you probably know a little ditty that goes with that, 1492. Yep, you guessed it. Christopher Columbus discovered the island of Cuba. It was previously, it was inhabited by the Taino people, Taino, and they were the native population of the island. But in 1511, the first Spanish settlement was founded, and these native peoples were forced into a feudal-like encomienda system. And this is pretty much trademark for the Spanish and the rest of their colonies in the New World. They would subjugate, enslave, and force these people to take out the wealth of land, whether it be sugarcane, mineral resources, whatever it may be. So these people were subjugated. But in 1548, the native peoples were freed by the then governor, but a lot of the same practices lived on. In 1754, it was conquered by the British briefly in the 7 Years' War, but a year later, they swapped Florida and Cuba, so Spain was back in possession of its island territory of Cuba, and the British now had control of Florida. And that's why you see the lasting impact and the legacy of the Spanish in Florida, because it wasn't until 1754 that they were removed. As far as Cuba, it's a very interesting place because it's been conquered and occupied for a very long time. So a lot of the history in the turn of the 19th and the 20th century have been very tied to this occupation and desire for liberation and autonomy from an outside power. So moving on, after the trade of the island of Cuba and Florida, in 1868, there was a rebellion against Spain, and essentially the process of Spanish losing that territory began. And in 1898, the United States adopted Cuba, and it became a protectorate of the country. And then in 1902, it gained its full independence from the U.S. Now, obviously, the U.S. impact stayed there, the commercial interest, the tourism interest, but that didn't really happen until 1924 when a very U.S.-friendly President Machado was elected, and he really tried to get the tourism industry surging. So there was a lot of American investment at the time, which eventually led to Castro's rebellion. So in 1952, the Communist Party was outlawed, which kind of further helped fuel the rise of Castro and the revolutionary movement in Cuba. So he did eventually take over the country in 1958. And after this takeover, the socialist communist regime began in Cuba. And they very much allied themselves with the Soviet Union, and they kind of became an outpost in the West for the socialist and communist ideas of Russia. It was almost a power play by the Soviets to have that strategic place and ally in Cuba very close to their biggest mortal enemy, the United States. So the Cuban Missile Crisis ensued in 1962, and then the U.S. went full effect on the embargo, basically the banning of trade among the two countries. And this led to very much hostilities between the two countries. You can hear in Castro's many speeches that it is the Americans' fault. But recently that tension has kind of subsided, and with the resignation of Fidel Castro in 2008, the country opened itself up to less of a socialized and directed economy. And you're starting to see some of the changes of the beginning stages of kind of state-directed capitalism. But there's also a very large black market in Cuba, and that is because things are so tightly controlled by the government, and most everything is state-owned. You'll see a lot of especially in the video you just saw, that the tourist economy is very important in Cuba, and that's definitely surged with the ability of Americans to now travel to Cuba under certain circumstances. Before, it was not allowed, or very difficult to procure a visa to be able to travel. You had to have some type of diplomatic function, or be a student, or a missionary volunteer, something along those lines, to get into the country. But now that that's changed, you know, some of the salaries for engineers and doctors and lawyers are very low. The basic salary, I think, is about $2 a day. So, you know, cab drivers you'll see cab drivers, sandwich shop sellers, gardeners, farmers that are trained in engineering or in law or in politics, and they're working these jobs because they can make more money in the black market or in the private sector than they can making for the government. So it's a little tenuous. You know, there's a lot of complaints about, or criticisms of Cuba from the outside world, just as there is of North Korea. But there's also some good things about these countries. Cuba has a 99.9% literacy rate, one of the highest in the world. They also have a very developed education system and healthcare system, even though it doesn't quite reach the standards of the healthcare system in the US. It is a socialized system, so the cost to the people is nothing. But, you know, regardless of which side of that political spectrum you are on, it's a very interesting place that is definitely opening up to the world and becoming more part of the global scene after the collapse of the Soviets. The collapse of the Soviets was very tough in Cuba. There was food shortages, problems with getting fuel. And so a lot of people became disillusioned with the ideas of the government. So Raúl, who Fidel was the predecessor of, his successor, Raúl, his brother, has tried to make a lot of changes. So Cuba's changed. Now, in terms of the food and the drink in Cuba, Cuba really loves their pork, their rice, their black beans, their moros y cristianos, su lechón, su puerco. They have a lot of fresh fruit. But pork is primarily the main meat that is consumed in Cuba. They have a very nice food scene. If you ever had a Cuban sandwich, ropa vieja, there's a lot of really great Cuban dishes. In terms of drink, sugar cane is grown there, so thus they have rum, right? Rum is made of sugar cane, sugar, and so that is the drink of Cuba, un mojito cubano, right? And dance, they love their salsa, they love their jazz. They have beautiful music that is very much inspired by the African history, because in 1754, when the British briefly occupied Cuba, they imported a lot of African slaves that have had a very profound impact on the culture, the history, the music, the religion, the food of Cuba. And to this day, there's very many prominent Afro-Cubans who are not only in the US playing sports, but very active on the world stage. You also saw in the video the old cars, the old American cars that drive down the streets, because the embargo, they couldn't get new cars, so they had to stick with what they had. And the important cities, you have Havana, you have Santiago, you also have Guantanamo. That might ring a bell, right? Where the prison for the terrorists against the US government is located. So Cuba has a very interesting history. I hope you learned something today. And I also hope that you continue to investigate Cuba and all the different cities and places to visit there, as well as the things that make that culture unique to the rest of the Spanish-speaking world. Ciao, adios.